Art Chat TV is brought to you by Linda Fisler Fine Art. Visit her website at lindafisler.com. Hi everybody, welcome to Art Chat. This is Linda Riesenberg Fisler, your host. Today we'll be interviewing Carolyn Anderson. We'll be talking about mastering edges. And there's so many different aspects to mastering edges. Hopefully between the pictures that will be shown as we're talking, you'll be able to get some great insight. So we'll be welcoming Carolyn in a few seconds. I also want to introduce my co-hosts,
Blanche McAlister Harris and Barbara Coleman. I'm going to read a little bit about Carolyn, and then we'll bring Carolyn in to say hello. So Carolyn's a nationally recognized artist, is accomplished pastelist and oil painter. She was born and raised in the Chicago area and attended the Illinois State University. She joined the VISTA program, Volunteers in Service to America, in the early 70s and was assigned to work on an Indian reservation in Montana. She eventually returned to Montana to live, and she's a master artist with the American Impressionist Society, a member of the Northwest Rendezvous, and participates in many of the nation's largest shows, and has had her work featured in numerous publications, including Southwest Art, Art of the West, American Artist, the Big Sky Journal. And awards include the C.M. Russell Artist Choice, several NWR, which is the Northwest Rendezvous Award of Excellence, 2 C.M. Russell Best of Shows, and several Master Awards of Excellence for the American Impressionist Society. Carolyn teaches numerous painting workshops across the country. She's taught for the Frye Museum in Seattle, Walt Disney Imagineering, and the Scottsdale Artist School, and also the Fetchman Artist School. Her work is in a collection of many well-known artists and also in the collection of the Montana Historical Society. Welcome, Carolyn, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And like Barbara said, we're very, very excited, and I want to jump right into our conversation about edges if we can, because we know we've got a lot of things to cover. So I'm going to turn it over to Blanche and let Blanche ask you the first question.
Okay.
Hey, Carolyn.
Hi, Blanche.
This is a big subject, so I thought I'll just jump right in. It'd probably be a good start to understand edges from some kind of foundation or beginning. Edges are probably the most challenging, and therefore we could probably say one of the most misunderstood tools in an artist's arsenal. A lot of that has to do with the importance of understanding how we see. Can you talk about how we see and how that corresponds to how we should capture it in our paintings? Big question.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say that no artist should be intimidated by edges. Painters have had a handle on dealing with edges since at least the 1500s. We've got a long history here of edge painting. Exploring the technical aspect of painting edges is really available to anyone who has access to images from any of the artists we consider masters. The one advantage we have today, however, is the ability to probably better understand how our vision system works and how we see. So really, edges is all about seeing. I don't think a lot of artists understand how important that is. And a lot of times when people say they don't see the edge, well, that's true. They just don't see it. So it's part of the whole vision process. So how we see is really a process of interpretation, with the brain doing the interpreting. We do not necessarily see what we think we see. The brain will often alter, rearrange, or sometimes even eliminate raw visual information. We actually see what we expect to see and what we have learned to see. Vision is information processing, not information transmission, and that's an important thing to remember. So we aren't like recording movies in our brain here. The brain is processing everything that we see. So a good example of this, in my workshops, I like to convince people first and foremost that they don't see what they think they see. And a good example of this is something we do all the time, and that's look in a mirror. So we see ourselves as life size in a mirror. But if you actually measure the image looking back at you, you'll see it's really only about 1/2 life size. I call it the little shrunken head.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, that's quite a difference, and it's really easy to do. You don't even need a ruler. Just hold your, stretch your hand out, hold it up against your face, and then measure against the mirror. So what we need to understand is how what we think about something can actually impact what we see. And that's a good example of the whole head thing. We know ourselves to be life-size. We tend to see ourselves as life-size. If you walk into your kitchen in the morning, for example, and you see some fruit, maybe a banana, an apple, and an orange, it is probably a choice of maybe something to eat for breakfast. But if, on the other hand, you take that fruit, you arrange it on a table or set it up in your studio, maybe throw a light on it, it becomes something else. It's no longer an apple, an orange, and banana. It becomes a still life. And then the individual fruit becomes part of a larger scenario, and instead of individual objects, we now have a relationship of visual information based on shapes, color, value, and, of course, edges. This is visual information we don't necessarily need to see on a day-to-day basis. When you walk into that kitchen, you want to know if that stuff is ripe and if you can eat it, right? So we don't qualify some of that visual information that is actually always there. So we just really don't see much of this information unless we learn to look for it. The way that we actually see, and a lot of people don't really grasp this concept, we actually tend to see in symbols. And those are learned symbols, and they're kind of what I call a simplified version of reality. And we've acquired all this symbol set information from childhood. So, for example, oranges are round, apples are red, just good basic information. So on a day-to-day basis, we don't need to quantify the light or the shadow or exactly how the color is affected by the light. We also don't need to see what kind of edge that piece of fruit has. In fact, we don't usually even quantify edge information at all. So it really is a matter of whether or not we're seeing that information. We tend to see objects as solid. I kind of call it the chair effect. If you walk into a room with a chair in it, what do you need to know? You need to know what the shape and outline of that chair is, because you're either going to walk around it or you're going to sit in it. If there's a glass on the table, you need to know what the outline of that glass is so you can grab a hold of it. We see a solid shape and we don't see the relationship of all the pieces of visual information. We don't need to quantify the type of edges we are seeing. Therefore, we don't see them. Edges are really not elusive. We just need to look for the information. Oops, hold on a second.
We have to look and know what we're looking for.
Yeah, so artists sometimes, think that this is some kind of little magic thing going on out there, and it really isn't. An artist just needs to understand how important it is to question what he or she is seeing. If the information is not apparent, if you don't see it at first glance, you just need to keep looking. And if you don't see it again, you need to keep looking more. It's basically like turning a switch on in your brain, saying, I want to see this information. So it takes a little effort, but it's really not that difficult.
Yeah.
Carolyn,
we just train ourselves. Go ahead, Linda.
No, I was just going to say one of the things that I find really useful to remind me about doing that is if you hold your hand out in front of you and you look at your hand, how soft everything is behind it. If I'm focusing on edges, more or less, how hard edge my hand is, and then how soft the background behind it is, because I'm focused in that one area. So
we can only focus on a really small area at a time. So our eyes are constantly moving around. And what happens is that when we go to paint, that's totally unnatural. Staring at one thing for, too long is totally unnatural to how we actually see. So it helps to make a real concerted effort to move your eyes around on the canvas also and not stare. You don't want to take information out of context, because we basically see in context. We see the whole. And so when we start painting and we start, painting on one little area for too long, that information is taken out of context, and then it loses its relationship to everything else.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then when you're looking at what you're painting, you look at one part and then the other part, and different things come in focus.
Yeah, and then keep in mind that when you look at something for a longer period of time, it actually changes. So if you stare at one thing and And here again, if you lose the context of the whole, the relationships of the pieces themselves visually change. So they can change in value, they can change in color, all kinds of weird things can happen here.
Yeah, it's kind of like eyes playing tricks on you.
It kind of, yeah.
Well, staying with the basics, can you tell us the different edge types and their appropriate uses in the painting?
I'm probably not a big fan of that limiting edge information to a list of types and uses. It's kind of like verbal things that get in the way. Sometimes when you limit the possibilities, you don't always see the possibilities. So I think the more important information to remember is as compared to, because that's one of the most important tools that our visual system uses. I mean, that's a basic part of how our vision actually works, as compared to. And, of course, that's an obvious thing that painters use. So I think as compared to. So it's fairly easy to observe obvious differences in visual information. For example, like a strong light and a dark shadow. We can see the obvious stuff. That's where we're actually kind of wired to see the most obvious stuff. But it's a little bit more difficult then to observe and try and quantify information that is not as obvious. So, unfortunately, most edge information kind of falls into this category. So I think it's best to look for the most obvious, the hardest edge, and then the softest edge. And then then trying to figure out what's going on from there is just a matter of going with as compared to. But you always want to go back to your hard edge and your soft edge and compare your information. So like I said, you always use that obvious stuff, and you compare everything else to that. It becomes way easier to see everything. So, it's a matter of if we become too dependent on what we think an edge is, that the whole thinking and the visual stuff gets in the way here, we can overlook those changes that actually make the transition from one area to another.
So it's sort of like when you're looking at colors, you're painting and you see a million greens and you start looking at them and this one's a little more red, this one has a little more yellow.
Exactly.
But you pair it down that way.
You don't see it unless you compare. If you start out with just the basic premise of green, then you've got green. It's not until you start comparing those changes. But like I tell my students, you always look for the obvious stuff, whether it's the obvious shape, the obvious value, the obvious color, and you compare, opposites. So, compare your lightest light to your darkest dark, Compare your softest edge to your hardest edge.
Right. Good. And then we also had a question from Jessie in the Ammo Painting Challenge group asking what your process is, which I think you've been beginning to describe that, and how you decide to put what kind of edge where.
Well, my basic plan is always to ask myself what defines the form. It's as simple as that. It's not. Edges aren't really arbitrary. It's what defines the form. So, would it be a change in value or color, or is it a change in the shape of the form, or often it's a change in the information around the form? Just like we were talking just a while ago about the hand and everything being blurry behind it. So it's a lot of times it's the information around the form that is determining what kind of edge we're seeing. So. I do have a few things that I use with my students, and basically, number one would be the rounder the form, the softer the edge. This is just basic dimensional information. So we're creating the illusion of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface, and sometimes we need to remember we need to exaggerate some of that information a little bit. So for the farther away, the softer the edge. So we can look at that as just basic atmospheric information or perhaps focus information. But then the third thing, and this is really important to remember, is what I refer to as the artist trumps all. Where do you want to call attention to something? Artist trumps all. So if you've got the rounder the form, the softer the edge, farther away, softer the edge, artist trumps all. Where do you want to call attention to something, and where do you want to draw attention away from something? So, another thing you can do, too, is to pay attention to the quality of edges created from side to side, the edges that would be opposite one another on a horizontal plane. So they should always have variety, and they should not necessarily be the same, because that's part of creating that illusion of dimensional space. So exactly opposite one another on a horizontal plane. You don't want the same quality of edge. It kind of defeats the whole idea of dimensional.
Can you tell we're taking notes?
Yeah. So you know, in the big picture, in my own painting, I really try to quantify the edges as I see them. They really are not arbitrary. They define our three-dimensional reality. But it's just that I don't necessarily always try to recreate them, but I want to know what they are so I can use that information for interpretation.
Great.
Nice.
This is great information. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
So, okay, I just want to check here. Blanche or Barbara, do you have anything else to ask her before we jump into the question that I'm going to ask? Or do you guys, anything that she said so far?
No, I can take notes and ask later.
Okay. They're writing the questions for later.
Yeah, I was looking at a big jug here near my desk, and I'm seeing the different edges when the background is similar to the color of the object. The edge looks a lot softer, and then when the background color contrasts with it, the edge looks a lot harder. I guess those are the lost and found edges where it's about the same value for the background and the color of the object. But
well, you know, value is one of the most obvious factors we deal with as painters. You know, I mean, that's just it's easier to see value than it is color for a lot of people. It's easier to see value than it is to quantify edges. You know, and like I said before, noticing obvious differences is a primary component of our visual system. So we're more likely to see more contrasty value than anything else. But color can do the same thing. You know, kind of with not. I don't want to offend all the colorists out there. However, I call seeing color an app, because basically in the evolution of human vision, value, contrast, and movement came first. They're primary to the visual system. Color kind of is an add-on, if you will. But we have to recognize it's really important when we're painting. So, you know, I don't think a lot of times artists consider how the information around something alters the perception of the edges. So you do have, like, inherent, you know, change in edge depending on the object. You know, is it a crease? Is it a cardboard box? Is it rounded? You know, and then even pay attention to the fact that something, let's say like an orange, for example, even though it's round, it's not like round like a circle. You know, it still has a variety of edge, and that variety of edge comes from the light that modifies the form.
Yeah.
And then we get the information around it, whatever's going on. You know, like I said, you know, it's not. If you go to paint stuff like that, it's not just a piece of fruit anymore. It's part of a whole. It becomes something else.
Yeah, so we're painting a bunch of relationships.
Exactly.
And honestly,
and ultimately, a lot of this is what I call a mind game, because we need to be really careful sometimes of naming the thing, if you will. You know, I love it when I get students that, you know, figures and backgrounds always seem to be an issue, and I understand what's going on, and I understand what it's a problem, but I always tell students if they've painted the whole head and they get to the end of the painting and then they go, what do I do with the background, they've got a problem. Because right from the beginning they set up a separation from what they already painted to information that they consider just to be around what they painted, you know. So you don't see it as a whole then.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you use edges to move the eye through the painting?
Well, you know, obviously sharper edges are going to catch the eye, you know. More, you know, soft edges, it's like going into shadow, you know, it kind of disappears. So, yeah, soft edges are going to catch the eye. You know, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to to, kind of hold the eye in certain areas for a little bit longer, and obviously edges are one. But you also need to keep in mind that that's part of how we see, because everything's not in focus. The brain is pretty much taking all kinds of these jumbled pieces of information and putting it together into a picture based on what you already know and what you expect to see. So when we look at something, we only see that small area that's actually in focus. So that's why a lot of times, paintings that have too many edges just don't look real.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a focal point in a painting, those edges would be more crisp than the ones on the periphery?
Well, generally, sure. You don't want your sharpest information going off the edges of the canvas, It's just like there's certain things that I call are like tools in our tool belt, if you will. It's like the lightest light and the darkest dark is going to hold the eye, too. So, a combination of those factors can be used in any painting. But, you don't want to overthink it. The problem comes into painting because we're going from, kind of right brain and left brain information, and we're going back and forth between handling different kinds of information. And that's a difficult thing to do. It's a difficult thing to consciously go back and forth, left brain, right brain, and it's back and forth, back and forth. But there are certain things about painting that facilitate that. But you need to always, like I say, you need to just make sure that this is a little bit of a mind game here. So you want to stay as much as possible in that right brain mode, which is seeing relationships and it's seeing the whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I used to teach drawing at the university, and and getting into right brain, left brain mode, and the symbolic system that you describe is so powerful that until you become conscious of it, and even when you are conscious of it, it can still slip in. And
definitely.
I would have the students. I say, look, you can just draw me a cat. Just draw me a cat. There's no cat here. You can't see a cat. So just draw me a cat. And in general, almost everyone would draw the symbol of the cat they made up when they were 6 years old.
Yeah.
And it was just all there. And then when they see the real cat and get into the miracle of the specificity of a real cat and its angles and proportions and the value of the light, shadow, that was so fascinating to get into that. And then they'd start to see the difference about, seeing the real visual information versus what we worked so hard to create when we were 6, 7, 8 years old, that whole symbolic system.
Mm-hmm. And that symbol set of information lasts throughout our lives. And, basically most people, and I'm not saying artists, but most people have probably the visual language IQ of a 10-year-old, because by that time you've pretty much learned everything you need to know about how to navigate the visual world. And people don't go beyond that because they don't need to.
Yeah. And when they're teenagers, having raised 3 of them, when they really want to draw something that they see and get to that next level, there's often not a lot of help of how to get over that stumbling block of your symbol system to real seeing.
And so then they get discouraged.
A few criticisms and they just give up.
Right.
The tough thing.
Yeah, they reach a point where what they want is real. And then, most people aren't capable of teaching that. So.
Yeah, they're not. They don't know what you've even been describing. And it's frustrating. It's heartbreaking to see, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
On one of our previous shows, Carol, we had a guest say that edges are the soul of the painting. And, of course, that gets into some very esoteric type of relationships, if you will. Like, if you think about souls, and it's a very intangible thing, and of course, you're starting off and you're saying this isn't that elusive.
Well, it's not. But
what do you think? Good.
I think the statement's probably pretty accurate, though, because of what we were talking about. How on a day-to-day basis we don't qualify edges. That's just is visual information that is not necessary, okay? And so because most people don't see edges, they can obviously have some kind of, elusive quality. But I think edges are really part of that scene information that, most people just don't notice. So as artists, that's our job, is to see the relationship of visual information and to paint those transitions. There's a book that I read, in fact, it's probably the absolutely best definition of edges I've ever read, and this actually came from a gardening book, not an art book, which is kind of phenomenal. But the book is called Gaia's Garden. It was written by Toby Hemingway, and I have to give her credit because I use this quote all the time. Anyway, in it she wrote, and I think this will totally answer your question here, edges are where things happen. The edge is richer than what lies on either side. The decision to increase or decrease an edge depends on what lies on either side of the edge and what we want to see from it. Edges allow us to define spaces, see their boundaries, as well as what flows across them. They are places of transition and translation, where matter and energy change speed or stop or often change into something else.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Oh, that's,
it
what
is.
was the name of that book? It was by Toby?
It was Gaia's Garden, home scale permaculture or something, I don't know, written by Toby Hemingway.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's also true in ecology. Edges are where things happen. The edge of the pond, the shore of the pond, the edge of the ocean, the shoreline.
Exactly. And so, obviously in gardening, you could be talking about the transitional area, let's say from green space in your backyard to the edges perhaps towards a fence where, and that's where stuff happens, where you'll see the birds and things like that. So it's just a great quote. I hand it out to all my students.
Yeah, that is.
A really nice quote. So, Carolyn, can you talk a little bit about, how edges convey mood and feeling in a painting? If we go into that realm a little bit.
Probably not. I'm not. I'm not a mood painter.
Okay.
I think my paintings create a mood because I use lost and found information. But I don't say. I'm real careful around what I consider can be information that can go trite in a heartbeat. So because some of that stuff just gets a little too obvious. So I figured that a good painting will have some kind of soul to it. It'll have some kind of feeling, So I don't really need to impose something on it, And
so it's more of what happens while you're painting versus saying I'm going to make it happen this way, or
kind of.
It's just something that creates.
It's just we can fall into trite little symbol patterns easily, and it can be the same thing with mood. Like I say, over the years I continually go back and forth, and I paint children, and I look at some of the subject matter I've chosen to paint over the years, and I have to say what I've done, and I realize it now, is I've taken what could be really trite information, like a head of a little kid, for example, and tried to make the paint itself speak strongly enough that what you're seeing is not trite information. It's not necessarily like, oh, what a cute little kid. I mean, it could be a cute little kid, but that's not the primary reason why I would paint it. So I'm probably not a good person to speak about mood in painting.
But I don't know if that's true or not, because like I said, I look at your paintings, and like you said, they do create a lot of mood and stuff. But that doesn't mean that's where you're.
I think that probably does come from the lost and found edge information and lost and found information. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Carolyn,
and you know what?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say I do appreciate that, that honesty in your answer, Carolyn, because I'd rather hear you say something like that than sit here and talk for 25 minutes about something that you don't believe in.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Blanche.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was going to ask a question that Mariana Duford, who is in our Ammo Painting Challenge group, wanted us to ask. It's about your theory on how color and value are used to make edges recede and stand out. And I think we touched on that.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, well, like I said,
a little bit.
Value is one of the most obvious things that we see, okay, and especially higher contrast. But I think what a lot of artists miss is the fact that you can turn a form or soften an edge just by using a color change. You don't necessarily have to change the value, and that's an important thing. I mean, in order to keep a value pattern, fairly clean and not too cluttered up sometimes, you need to remember that you can just change that color tone just a little bit, and it will turn the form. It's just amazing how, you think it would have to be a value. Well, it does not have to be a value at all. And on the same token, you can create a harder edge by using, a little bit of contrasting color, and it's still the same value. Now, you can also lose edges, or soften them by having the same value, for example, and then changing the color. So, there's a lot of uses for just using color information and not always value information. And especially when you want to turn and transition something into something else, and you don't want to, value sometimes is, isn't always the tool to use. And so color is really handy that way. But I think the one thing that a lot of artists miss, however, is that color creates a pattern, just like value does. And it basically comes down to the science of color. And as artists, we can just sum it up pretty much as, like warmer light, cooler shadow, cooler light, warmer shadow. It's a science there. So, in other words, if you're going to go from, let's say, a blue to a red, you're going to have some kind of transition in there. So it'd be more likely you'd be going, let's say, ultramarine to alizarin instead of ultramarine and going to cad. It doesn't work that way. So I tell my students just to think about a rainbow, because that's pretty much what it is. That's the science of light. Science of color. So you need to think about those transitions in your painting. But it really is useful, and I use it quite a bit, where I just need to turn an edge just slightly, and I'll just change the color temperature just a little bit. Keep the value the same, but change the color temperature.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I know you weren't prepared for me to ask this, but are there some books that you could recommend that artists need? A real obvious one, but I know some people kind of maybe turn up their nose because they think it's a little too basic or something, but I tell all my students that drawing on the right side of the brain should be in their library. The book that
That's a great book.
Wrote, because it just gives you a lot of good information. It's not like you have to step through and do the drawing exercises, because basically what she was doing in there was teaching basic drawing to people who had no skill whatsoever. So it's not artistic drawing. It's not interpretive drawing. But what she talks about is really valuable information. I think, so that's a great one. I always tell people, Richard Schmidt's Alla Prima is, can't be beat for the wealth of information. I think if you're into, if anybody wants to touch on the science part of it at all, Vision and Art, The Biology of Seeing by Margaret Livingstone is
You recommended that somewhere, something I read, and I went and I got it, and it's fabulous.
It is a good book, yeah. I've had some students complain that it has too much science, but I tell them you don't have to read the whole thing. It has lots of pictures, So
Yeah. No, it's really good.
You aren't going to get tested at the end of it, So you read the stuff that you find important.
Yeah, you can skip over some of the scientific parts.
Yeah.
So it's called Vision in Art?
Vision and Art.
And Art.
Vision and Art. Yeah, Margaret Livingstone. And then, one that I turn to sometimes, and I just think it's a fun little book, and it's called The Annotated Mona Lisa. And it's basically a crash course in art history. And I think a lot of artists can use it. I've never heard of that book. Yeah, it's kind of, surprisingly a lot of information is crammed into a little book, but
very nice.
I think a lot of artists could use a refresher course, or most of us can use a refresher course on art history sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
If we don't know our history, we are doomed to repeat it.
Well, that's great. Drawing on the right side of the brain, most of us probably have that, but we could
reread it.
It'd be great to reread it, yeah. I was just rereading Carlson's book on landscape painting.
Right,
and, I saw so much in there that I didn't see before. So it's always fun to go back.
And, Robert Henry's The Art Spirit. That's another classic for artists.
Oh, yeah. That's a great
John Sloan also wrote a book that was pretty good, too. I can't think of the title offhand, but that was, John Sloan from the Ashcan School. Oh, Gist of Art. That's what it was,
Gist of Art, okay.
Yeah, and that's got interesting stuff in it.
Well, we're over here making lists as fast as we can.
I know.
Yeah, there you go.
Scribbling away.
And there are lots of books out there on visual stuff. Some more basic ones like, I have one in my library called Basic Vision, an Introduction to Visual Perception. There's another one called Perception, and they're fairly straightforward intros into visual perception for anyone who's more interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting when you...
Well, that's great. Thank you. Go ahead, Linda.
I was just thinking, it's interesting when you start looking at all the different subjects that Carolyn has listed here, just with the list of books. I mean, you got into the study of vision, how we see science of that, and then the art history part of it and all this. And it's like, how can you, I don't know, it's just a point, we don't have to get into it, but it's like, how can you say that art education in schools is not important? I look at the different subjects that we
Well, the important thing to remember about art education that a lot of people is that it changes the wiring in your brain. It changes your perception. And that's the important thing. It's not just some little activity we get kids, to do and give them paper plates to cut up or something. It's like learning another language. It's just important facets to brain wiring that are tapped into when we learn art.
Mm-hmm. And I found it really interesting too. I was having a conversation with Michael Pierce out at Cal Lutheran, and he was making the comment that I think 11% of art purchases are happening in the U.S. And I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was close to 50%, if not over 50% of art purchases are now being made in China.
Interesting.
And it was just, and I said, as Michael and I were talking, it was like, well, look where we are in the U.S. where we're not teaching kids to appreciate art. We're not.
Exactly.
So it's not surprising to me that number in the U.S. is going down. They don't know how to appreciate that.
No, they don't. And when people, the interesting thing that I found over the years, when people do not understand visual language, they don't understand the spatial relationships and, et cetera, then they have a tendency to focus on the detail. And that comes back to that whole symbol set of information, because that's what we're comfortable with, and that's basically what we learned as children, make sure you draw all the little fingers and the little buttons and the little things like that. And that's where people's visual language kind of gets stuck.
Right.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah, it is. Now we're getting a little bit off topic here, but that's okay because I think it's been a lot of good information. So I think, Barbara, you do have the next question?
Well, we have another question from the Painting Challenge group from Cruz. And so he was wondering, he says that painting is a mix of what you see and what you recreate, playing with color, values, light, and edges. And he says, I can imagine Carolyn is challenging herself all the time with creativity. And he wants you to tell us a few of your transition or edges exercises or challenges.
Well, I don't know that I specifically use any exercises. I do, however, a lot of times approach a painting with the idea of perhaps losing as many edges as I can while still holding the image together. See, that's the key, But I tend to see chaos as just like a pattern that we don't recognize, And
nice.
By doing this,
nice quote.
Well, yeah, truly it is. So, but I'm really surprised a lot of times in painting about how little object information is really necessary to still see form. Because we are programmed to notice value contrast. We pay attention to things like line, obviously shape, and color pattern, and value pattern, and all those things will move the eye around the canvas and create the illusion of, dimensional form. So the one thing I don't do, though, is what I refer to as the coloring book approach. And I know a lot of artists kind of learn this, or they do it, and that's basically to draw outlines and proceed to fill them in, So, yeah, I think, too many artists do that. And once you get a solid outline, you're just feeding right into left brain information. It's really difficult to, kind of get out of that. In other words, you create a solid outline, and then we have to work like crazy to try and, modify and mitigate the edges. That's where people get all caught up in the whole edge thing. I don't know what to do with it. Well, you should have identified the edges before you got that far. When you were drawing, you should have observed the edges, because that's what a good drawing's all about. It's just that for some reason we get into paint, and then it tends to complicate things for people. So, instead of working like crazy to try and change all those edges after creating solid form, I avoid creating solid form. I look for the information that says to me, what creates this form. So, it's here again. It seems to make sense to, look for the value pattern first, light and dark. Try and identify your color pattern, and then work your shapes accordingly. So, and like we mentioned before too, a lot of that edge information is not just part of an object itself. It's the information around it. It's part of the whole. So, that's kind of how I approach it. That's for sure.
So when you're starting a painting, are you doing that? Are you kind of blocking in your value pattern first?
Yep. Exactly. Okay. I always go to, identifying that. Of course, we're working with what I say is shadow defining light. So I'm working with the darks to define my lights. I don't paint the lights, to begin with. And what happens is whenever you start getting marks on your canvas that get in the way of seeing the shapes, which can happen sometime if you create too many outlines, or you make marks in your light value areas, it kind of confuses the whole idea of shape. So I try and stick with the visual information. So use the darks, follow through. I see a dark here, and darks are always going to create some kind of pattern, and then make the next dark and so forth and so on, and hopefully, you get enough stuff on there and all the pieces kind of come together and you don't have anything too far off. But like I tell people, it's oil paint. You can change it. And another thing to keep in mind too, in a lot of information, you're always better to overpaint or underpaint to what's a perceived edge. Okay, instead of working up to like what you think is a line. Overpaint it or underpaint it. Make the decision which. Different information requires stuff, and then you come back with another brush stroke. See? Okay. And that modifies the edge, so you don't have to noodle all those edges.
Nice. That makes a lot of sense. May I ask you a question about your brush work?
Sure.
When I look at most of your paintings, it looks like you're using sort of a draw technique.
Right.
What sort of brushes and all do you use? Are you using larger brushes?
Well, I use primarily bristle brushes, flats. I'm not a fan of little short stubby brushes, as my students will attest, because I say they do nothing but scrub. I want a brush that I can make a variety of marks with, without too much thought. So I like flats. I throw them away when they start to wear out, okay? Yeah. When they start to get short, which they do, I pitch them. So I want to lengthen the brush. And then, I always keep like some kind of synthetic round that I kind of call either my noodle brush or my drawing brush. But, sometimes you need to make little marks, And sometimes you just kind of need to, work your drawing a little bit or work the form. So I always use some kind of synthetic round. But basically just the bristle brushes. And I do work dry. I don't start out with, I don't use much medium. And I try and keep the paint thin to begin with and build up. The idea is if you get that paint surface on your canvas wet and sloppy right at the beginning, you cannot modify your edges. Well, you can, but you kind of have to get into the whole let this stuff dry and then come back and, do some modifying.
Yeah.
So, I try and keep, that whole dry brush effect going, and build up the paint from there. And that way I get a variety of edge right from the beginning. So in other words, I tell my students to start your painting so it looks kind of like a charcoal drawing.
Okay, I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah,
nice.
So it has that kind of visual effect, like a charcoal drawing, like you would do a charcoal drawing.
Mhm. That makes
So you're not using a lot of color when you start. You're starting in grays?
I start neutrals, and on my palette I always start out with I mix up gold ochre, which is kind of like a Rossiana, or else yellow ochre, and my mineral violet. Kind of gives me a nice neutral mid-value that I can either kind of warm up or cool off, And so I start there and then gradually, work into adding the color.
Okay.
Great. I start my mark making with that. I'm always looking for something that's reasonably neutral, middle value, works. You don't want to I don't like to start with a strong color because it's going to have something to do with, it's going to read through on the stuff you come in on the top with, and so I just like to keep it neutral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that doesn't matter if you're doing a portrait or like the ones that we're showing you, the horses, and but you start the same way no matter what the subject.
You've got to start somewhere. You have to start creating what I call the "you are here" map. I reference this like the maps in the airport terminals. You are here. So you need to get some marks on there, because that's the problem. Where I think a lot of people use contour drawing or outlines. That's their map. But I would rather use the dark pattern, and then in turn what we're seeing is light dark pattern for my "you are here" map instead of outline.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's good. A good way to think about it.
Description.
Yeah. And it looks like your the canvases are have a lot of texture to them.
Well, reasonable amount. I usually use like Clausen 66, which is considered more landscape canvas, I think, than portrait canvas. But I don't do typical portraits, so.
Yeah. Well, they're just beautiful.
Thank you.
One thing I want to touch on, Carolyn, was something that we talked about before we went on the air around photo reference. And I had made the comment to you, which was a misperception, that, you can tell when someone takes from a photograph because everything's hard-edged and the photograph is all hard-edged. And you said...
and I said that is a misperception, that sometimes in some of my workshops I actually have taken a couple photographs and projected them up, after we go through a lecture on visual language, and then I show different images like sergeants and thorns and step them through the edges on that material. But I've used photographs also to put up on the screen so I can step them through the variety of edges on a photograph. And here again, it's just something that we obviously don't see because we don't look for it, but it is always there. We lose some of that depth perception, but the edges are always there. And basically because edges are determined by what? Number one thing is form, the rounder the form, that kind of thing, okay? And then also the quality of the light, okay? And then, it can be what the color's doing. But they're there. They're there in photographs. And if you don't see them, blow the photograph up and look again.
Mm-hmm. It's all there to be seen, just not looking in the right way.
Exactly. We aren't seeing them because, number one, we seem to have it in our heads that photos are all hard-edged, so it's that misperception which messes up with our seeing, and so we actually don't go looking for it, and you might look at a photograph and you go, well, she doesn't know what she's talking about. This looks all, you got to look again, You have to look again, and you'll see the variety of edge.
Yeah, I think that all goes back to our coloring book mentality. We all learn that.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
We like all those crisp edges on everything as our roadmap until we can start thinking about it in a different way.
That's how we see. See, that's the problem. That is actually how we see. We see those. We see them as hard edges, and they aren't. But like I said, it's a process of just kind of turning that switch on in your brain and going, okay, no, I'm going to look for this. I'm going to find it, And the other thing that artists can do, too, is to, we've got great examples throughout art history, and I like to use Sargent and Zorn as examples because they did some nice creative edge work. I also use Fession, as examples. But if you take some of the work, it can be like in art books that you have at home, and take it out of context, or maybe take a picture of, an image in the book, and then blow up certain sections of it just a little bit, and then start comparing edges from side to side, because that's the best way to do it, as compared to. So go on one side of the form where maybe the light is, opposite side, and look at to see how they handled edges. And there's different ways of handling edges, but they're good examples.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, that was one of our questions.
Great.
That was one of the questions you were going to talk about is kind of how edges are throughout history and have they changed, because are we seeing different today versus in the past?
Well, there have been changes, but are things different today? I think we're a lot harder edge today, to tell the truth. I tend to see this as a two-dimensional world going on here, and it's kind of reflected in a lot of the art. But if you go back in time, the Renaissance, the 1500s, for crying out loud, is when they did the big breakthrough in light and shadow, perspective, modeling form with edges, turning the form in dimensional space so the figures actually look real. And then we went for like hundreds of years just with variations of that information. And then you get up, you've got, Sargent and Zorn and all those guys. Sorolla is another good one to study. Fession obviously came later, so we've got a different kind of thing going on there. But then you got the Impressionists, that was over 100 years ago. And you talk about expression and losing information, hello,
Right.
Absolutely.
So it's all out there. Like I said, if we don't know our history, we are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, it is true. It's just like you said, just picking up a book and opening up any of the books that you have in your library of past masters or past work, and just sitting there studying that is not time wasted. It's a good investment.
No, but like I said, sometimes you need to take the information out of context. Like, say, if you're looking at a Sargent full figure thing, like the whole figure, no, you need to find a close-up of it to actually quantify the edges, for example.
Get out that magnifying glass and just look at one little area.
Oh, yeah.
That might blur it a little bit more than we need, but
yeah.
Carolyn, I'm trying to make a list for myself of different ways to manipulate edges. We've talked about color, value, and then just manipulating the paint to make a softer edge or a crisp edge.
You want to underpaint or overpaint?
Overpaint.
Underpaint or overpaint an edge, never up to.
Yeah.
I think that's a good sound way. But, don't, like I said, it's not a matter of trying to learn a list of things you should do in your painting. It really isn't. It's basically about trusting yourself to look at information and try and figure out what's going on. And sometimes some of the stuff is good to know because it tells you where to look, for example. So you're looking at something kind of, hey, I don't see it. Well, that's why studying some of the other, artists can be a good thing, because then kind of know where to look. But the other thing that people miss is there's always a variety of edge in the smallest part of a form. It's not, let's say, like we take an orange and we just go that orange is all round. No, it's still going to have a variety of edge all the way around. Edge change, edge change, edge change, edge, even on an orange. So you just have to look for the information. Don't get too caught up in thinking, oh, no, what do I have to do here? Well, just look to see what's going on. Paint it. If it doesn't look right, figure out why,
Yeah, as I say, you don't have to name it necessarily. Name it an edge, what type of edge it is. Just what's going on with that form and color and value and.
Exactly, it gets too confusing. Too much stuff.
Yeah.
Too confusing. Keep it to the
it's
basics.
all about seeing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Well, we're coming up on the, believe it or not, last 30 minutes of the show. So why don't we go to, I want to give Carolyn a opportunity to talk about what's coming up for her as well. So Blanche, your last question that you might have for Carolyn?
Let's see. As far as color, we were talking about color and turning forms. As a form turns away, it would tend to become cooler?
Well, it depends on the kind of light you have. Let's say, some artists like to work with, let's talk about faces, for example. Some artists like, or figures, some artists like to work with cool light, and then they have warmer shadow. My preference most of the time is usually for warmer light and cooler shadow. So let's say you've got a forehead shape, okay? And basically that forehead shape is going to be kind of rectangular probably. And as it gets towards the edge, the outside edge on that forehead shape, you know that it has to go somewhere, right? It's not like I could tell people, it's not a coloring book. It's not like you cut this out of a piece of paper. That edge has to go somewhere. So let's say the light on the forehead is a little warmer. Then right at the edge, you could turn it perhaps towards a little the violet or a little viridian, a little green, but still maintain the same value if that's what you need, if you need the same value going all the way across. So you could just transition that color then just a little bit over, and that'll turn the edge. It's just kind of amazing how that works, but it does.
And say you had cool light, and would it work the same way?
Oh, yeah, it works the same way. It doesn't make any difference, yeah. Yeah, but you just have to be careful with the warm stuff going on there, because if you get it too warm, it can pop forward, So that's where we talk about color pattern, because there's such a thing as, like warms that kind of go better with cools, and
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Barbara?
Yeah, I would just love to see you paint now. I'd love to see like the viscosity of the paint as you're painting. So if you're starting at the beginning and you think of it more as a charcoal drawing, and then as you build that up and you're not using much medium, I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about the paint viscosity.
Well, I use I use Holbein paints, which are fairly creamy. A lot of it depends on what kind of paint you're using, too. People need to be aware of the difference in materials. So my paints are fairly creamy. They're fairly evenly creamy. I don't end up with colors that are stiff, for example, that actually, need something. Now, when I start out, if I need to get brush flow, for example, on, like something, then I'll just use a little of my, Gamsol for that. But it's just, I'm just using the paint, and I'm just building it up, and I just find it valuable to start with the information that, like I said, that I think is important. That's going to be the value. And then, but at the same time, you need to identify your color pattern, at the beginning. Where's your light coming from? Is it a warmer light or a cooler light? And then, as you start establishing the value, so you have enough information on that canvas, it should start to bear a relationship to what it is that you're painting, should have some kind of relationship. Then I'll start, working my way into color. I don't want to get too heavy in darker values without getting color tone, because that's not going to help any. So, and then, if it's a larger painting or something like that, chances are I'm going to have to go to some medium somewhere. But, or, I'll use medium if I have to go back into a painting, for example. But by and large, no, I stay away from it. I'm able to control my edges better.
Nice. Okay. Thank you.
Especially, I've gotten to see Carolyn paint a couple times now. Once out at Weekend with the Masters when she was holding some workshops out there, and I also saw her painting with CW at the American Impressionist Society meeting back in November, and it is a real treat to watch Carolyn paint. So if you get the opportunity, don't pass it by. Go and see her paint. I enjoyed it both times, Carolyn. So
thanks.
You may have not known that I was back there because I was sneaking in and out. It was fun, and it's really what I thought was really a lot of fun too. Was when CW was painting next to you at the American Impressionist Society, and it was just so much fun to see him turn and ask you questions. While he was painting.
Well, the last place we were at, we were just down in Texas. We were both teaching workshops at the same time, and this isn't true, but this is what he told his students. He was describing our doing that dual demonstration there. And painting the same model, and he told his students, he says, I just sat up behind Carolyn and I just copied her. Whatever she put, I didn't even look at the model. Whatever she put down, I just copied it.
He wasn't behind you. You're right. he was
I know he wasn't there, but he made a good story out of it anyway.
He's also quoted you several times as saying, "Show me something I haven't seen before."
Exactly. Yeah. I've seen that. Show me something I haven't seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So what do you have coming up? Workshops, shows?
Well, next weekend, Pre to West show in Oklahoma City.
Okay.
I think it's next weekend, something like that. And then I'll be doing a workshop in Jackson, Wyoming in June. And then in the fall, there's the American Impressionist Society show, and I'll be teaching a workshop in Easton, Maryland in the fall. So other than that, it's just, normal gallery, whatever stuff.
Okay. And hopefully a lot of paintings for you in the meantime, right?
Well, that would probably be a good thing, yeah. That would be a good thing, yeah.
Darn, right? Yeah, don't want to do that. Well, again,
yeah, I've just kind of been in a whole thing of painting and throwing.
Mm.
I know, as my son... Yeah, throwing them away. I don't know. I just kind of, I'm always looking for something just a little different. As my son told me, though, here a few weeks ago, I was talking to him on the phone. He says, "What are you up to?" He says, "I haven't talked to you in a while." And I said, "I've just been struggling with my painting. I just don't like anything I do." There's this long pause on the other end of the phone, and finally he goes, "What, you haven't figured out how to do it yet?"
Thank you. The ones that love you the most would always hurt you, right, Carolyn?
Mm-hmm.
So we have really appreciated you being on the show. Is there anything that we may have missed that you want to tell us that we maybe haven't asked? I know that leaves like a wide expanse of topics, but
that's stuff. I really, I guess, would just like to emphasize that people really need, we've always heard that, painting's about seeing. I just don't think that a lot of people have really understood how important that actually is. Mm-hmm. And so I know I run into this a lot of times in workshops where, I'll say, now, do you see that color in the shadow? For example, and they'll go, no. So then we have to step through obvious information first, and then I'll have them look at that shadow again. And then they'll usually go, oh, now I see it. And it's the same thing with edge information. I'll say, what do you see at the top of the head? Well, it's just the top of the head. It's, kind of like a line. No, okay, now let's compare. Let's go all the way around, from side all the way up over the top, down the other side, if you will, but, compare one side to the next, and let's look at the difference in the edges. And it's only then when people actually see the information. So, right. Like I said, the edge information is not arbitrary. It really, it's all there. It defines our three-dimensional reality. It's really critical. And so if you don't see it, you just need to keep looking. You really do. You need to force yourself to look and look again, and if you still can't figure it out, then drag out some of your art books and try and figure out what people were seeing and how they handled the information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great advice. So we're, I guess we're going to say goodbye here, and thank you again for being on the show. And,
I appreciate it.
Yeah, so we'd love to have you on again sometime. So if there's something that comes up in your workshop and you want to come on the air and talk with us about it, feel free to drop me a line or give me a call.
Yeah, I think we should just turn it back to your listeners, and if there's anything specific that they think would make a good show, maybe that's where it needs to go.
That would be great, too, and they can drop me an email at my website, or Carolyn, I know that you have a contact. I think contact.
Yeah, it's on my website.
Your website as well. So
yep,
either way, that would absolutely be most welcome to hear from our listeners on that. So with that, I'm going to say thanks again. We appreciate your time, and
you're very welcome.
Thank you again. Yeah, thank you to our listeners for tuning in too. We've had over 106,000 listens since we started the program back in March of last year. So really excited that we have that many folks. So until next time, everybody have a great day and keep painting, and have a good night.
Art Chat TV is brought to you by Linda Fisler Fine Art. Visit her website at lindafisler.com.